and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. Shane Steadman is an expert in chiropractic neurology and functional medicine. Dr. Steadman is a leading practitioner in the area of concussions and brain injuries and works with patients in Denver, Colorado, and across the United States. Because of the extensive education, training, and success rate Dr. Steadman has achieved, he is one of the most sought-after health practitioners for patients dealing with difficult conditions, as well as those who have gone from doctor to doctor without answers and solutions. Dr. Steadman is also a speaker, regularly appearing on TV, podcasts like this one, and radio programs, sharing his expertise and advice about concussions and brain injuries, and a host of other conditions, including vertigo, migraines, and other tough cases. Dr. Steadman is also a lecturer for Apex Energetics and has been so since 2006. He teaches and educates other physicians and practitioners about the testing and clinical applications of functional endocrinology, immunology, and blood chemistry. Dr. Shane Steadman, what an honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I said, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, that's great. It's really exciting to have you on as well. In my Facebook stalking of you online, it looks like you're quite the local sports fan in Denver. Have you always been a sports fan of the Denver teams?
I've been in Denver now for 20 years, and I grew up in in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then did my undergrad and grad in Texas. So kind of going from Albuquerque to Denver, with a little pit stop, Denver has always kind of been the sports team because New Mexico really doesn't have much.
Right.
So you kind of grow up being kind of a Denver fan, and then you come here and this place has got all the sports, so it's hard not to be a fan.
Yeah, totally. Well, we're just on the other side of the hill, so in Salt Lake. So I can't be a Nuggets fan because we have the Jazz. Diehard fan. Yeah. Can't be a fan of the Rapids because of Real Salt Lake. But It was funny. It was a few years ago. I want to say it was the year after Denver lost in the Super Bowl and lost pretty bad, like from the very first play of scrimmage, like was not good. And I was in Denver and I was at a bar and the sports bashing kind of started and everybody started bashing the Rockies and everybody was kind of laughing and the Avs weren't very good. I loved the Avalanche, but they were, making fun of the Avalanche. They weren't that good. And that was funny and everybody was laughing. As soon as I mentioned the Broncos, the sound of like the record player, like stopping, like, and like every eyeball in that place was on me. I thought I was going to get the crap kicked out of me. You guys love the Broncos.
Yeah, you definitely don't talk bad about the Broncos in this state. It's kind of fun. It is definitely true.
Oh man. Well, I learned that one the hard way. Learning about concussions has been super interesting. And my stupid idiot self just kind of thought of concussions as like, yeah, you knocked your head. I watched the movie, don't knock your head repeatedly, bad things can happen. But really like researching this in preparation for this interview, I'm super, super excited to talk to you about this and educate the listeners about it, because I think this is a much more prevalent and dangerous situation that might not be treated correctly in a lot of cases. So really excited to deep dive into you. But before we do, how did you get interested in dealing with concussions and brain injuries?
I went into my undergrad and grad, wanting to be a chiropractic neurologist. And my mom had worked for one when I was in high school. So, I got to see hear all these cool stories that my mom would bring home. And so that was kind of like that was kind of the start of it. I was like, I want to do kind of what that guy did, So I went into this profession, and then, kind of getting into it, you really get into this concussion world because we've been doing concussion work, I would say before it really became popular, so to speak, and there's just nobody doing it. And even like the stuff that we're doing, it's hard to get out there and say, hey, we do concussion work because people still have that mindset of like, oh, you just walk it off, you'll be fine. Oh, you didn't vomit, you'll be fine. It's not a big deal. And so I've always kind of been into it, which kind of just made it easy when, definitely, I don't want to say the popularity, but at least the information was brought to the surface, brought to the forefront. The concussion movie came out, all these different things. And all of a sudden now everybody's talking about it and everybody's doing it. And so we were just kind of, following the wave, so to speak, going like, well, we've always been doing this. But what was kind of cool is that, with all this information coming out, now you have all these tools and now you have companies making, things that we can use and improving this and that and the other. So kind of, I've always done this, but I think with the information and people like you and podcasts and all this stuff, bringing all of this to the surface, now you have the world looking at concussions which has kind of made our job in this office more enjoyable, easier to some extent, because there's so much more research that's being done that has helped provide us the tools to say, okay, this is exactly what's going on. And even understanding it in more detail, just like you kind of mentioned, it's like the more you dive in, the more you realize there's so much to learn. And so you kind of get excited. And when you get to get people well, that just kind of keeps you coming back to work. It's like playing golf. You know, if you have that great golf shot, then you'll go play again. So it's kind of like when you get a patient well, you're like, oh, I got to come back to work tomorrow. That was awesome.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's amazing. And you kind of answered the question I was just going to ask, which is how has everything changed in the last 20 years? It seems like it is easier now because you have more of those tools that you didn't necessarily have in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, like one of the tools that we just acquired about a month ago it's called a gyrostem, you know, where you put people in, it kind of looks like a mini NASA, you know, kind of space thing, but you can turn people in different directions to kind of work on the vestibular system. You know, it's like, man, when I was first in practice, who had even dreamt of that? And then I would say probably 10 years ago, you know, that you finally saw somebody that came out with something like that. Actually, here in Denver was the original inventor of that. And it was like, that's really kind of interesting. And then now you see more and more people having one of those, you know, and you're like, okay, you know, so it's tools like that, or even like actually right before we got on this call, myself and the other doc, we were meeting with a rep who's got this really cool vagus nerve stimulator, which we do vagus nerve stimulation, but it's actually something that they're using that's FDA approved. So we actually were meeting with somebody and going like, okay, now we have this really cool FDA device that we could do some vagus nerve stimulation to rehab, you know, the brainstem, or rehab that autonomic dysautonomia POTS, you know, component of concussions. You know, so yeah, so we just got another tool in the office today that we can, you know, utilize. So I think just, yeah, with all this information coming out and all this research and technology, the things I have now, I wouldn't have even thought or dreamt, you know, or imagined having those kind of things when I was first in practice.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank God for smart people. That's amazing. Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, my experience with concussions, you know, I grew up, I played football, I played ice hockey. And I, you know, definitely it was the football thing that you get knocked around. And I remember those bell ringers and that kind of bolt of lightning that you feel through your spine. And, you know, back then it's like year 2000 or 1998 or whatever. And it's just, you sit out a play and then you run back in and you're totally fine. You know, as I was looking into this, it got less apparent to me what I even know about what a concussion is. So for me and the listener, can you just say, like, what is a concussion? What is happening?
So concussion is, yeah, it's funny. I pause because that is a great question, because I think we throw around terms, you know, so easily these days. You know, because sometimes you can actually, and I'll answer the question, but it's interesting how you hear the word concussion, you hear TBI, you hear MTBI, you know, and so people try to almost like delineate, is a concussion kind of like getting your bell rung, versus a TBI is, oh yeah, you got a TBI, that's bad. You know, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really kind of matter, because all of that is really what a concussion is, just your brain was injured, you know, and it could be injured in so many different directions, whether it's a stroke. I mean, that can kind of lead to a TBI, or, you know, a brain injury, or, you know, just getting your bell rung that, you know, kind of causes a little bit of brain fog. You know, so when you get the actual concussion, you know, you have the fire department in your brain that has to put out the fire, you know, and it's a closed system. And so it's definitely different than like rolling your ankle, where you say, hey, my ankle is swollen, it's purple, it hurts, I can't walk on it, I'll rest and ice it, and I should be good to go in a week. You know, your brain has this closed system where it definitely has its own like fire department and kind of its own immune system, so to speak, that when you ring your bell, you know, there's all this stuff that's going on, and sometimes you recover really well, and sometimes it can knock you for a loop. And I've definitely seen people that bump their head on a dresser and caused a concussion. You know, I've seen people who've had a whiplash injury, not even hit their head, but have concussion-like symptoms. And then you see people in a rollover car accident that seem to kind of walk away. So I think that's a great question you asked, like, what is a concussion? You know, probably at the end of the day, it's an injury to the brain, where the brain has to heal. So there may or may not be side effects depending on how your health is. That's kind of where we come into play to say, like, why does how do we fix this person with a concussion, and how are they different from another person that had a concussion?
So I hesitate to even ask this question. It seems like a lot of things that are problematic now were only because of our current, environmental situation. Like things that were protective in a hunter-gatherer society 15,000 years ago don't actually work that well in our current environment when we have sugar available everywhere, tons of processed foods, we're working inside all day versus getting outside and syncing ourselves up with the circadian rhythms, all that stuff. So is it even knowable? Did we evolve with this way to have a concussion for some type of protective, was this a protective thing for us as natural humans? Were we always bashing our heads around? Was this something maybe we evolved with and was protective in a certain, context, I guess?
I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. I think, I think this protective mechanism's always been there. I mean, we could probably sit here and if, we grabbed a glass of wine and just pondered this, but, sometimes you get people, like maybe some like artist, some artist or some like Renaissance person or some person who was a clairvoyant. I don't know, and maybe they did hit their head at one point and it changed how their whole entire brain worked. Now they're this amazing, Van Gogh artist or something like that. And you come to find out that, oh yeah, he was, they were climbing some hill and he fell down the hill and hit his head on a rock, and now he's super artistic. So I think we've always had these pieces and they can change us on who we are. But I think if I'm answering your question, I think what we kind of run into these days, like you mentioned, is, if you're indoor more often, if you are eating more sugar, you're not eating healthy, you're consuming chemicals, around chemicals, environmental issues, those actually can play a role in trying to understand, why does person A have a concussion and they seem totally fine? Person B can have the exact same concussion and now they can't work. They can't go to school, they can't work, and they have to give up their sports. So what makes that different? And obviously genetics can play a role. I mean, that's always kind of a given. But so this is kind of where people start wondering about like environmental, pieces. Like, do you live in a very smoke, polluted part of the country, or do you live, here in the mountains in Boulder, Colorado, where, it's, less polluted? There's so many different factors that can play a role that I think we've always had these protective mechanisms. I think it's just now kind of being brought to the surface on what can and cannot happen as a result of a concussion. So it kind of makes you wonder, 15,000 years ago, did we have these same things? Is that what made somebody kind of a different person in that society? Is that what made somebody become like, this really interesting, fascinating person that changed the world? I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely kind of interesting to know, what is your environment and how does that dictate on how well you can recover.
Yeah, no, that's a really thoughtful answer. And I really appreciate you, going out on a limb and kind of speculating that. I'm thinking of the Jerry Seinfeld bit where he's talking about like, why did we have to invent the helmet? We should have just stopped doing all the activities that required a helmet in the first place. What are some common symptoms of concussion that people, some of these might be really obvious, but what are some of the less obvious symptoms?
The less obvious symptoms, man, you're doing great questions today. So, because your obvious symptoms, maybe I can start there. Let me do that. Let me give you some obvious, I'll give you the less obvious, because I think everybody knows, and maybe not even this, because sometimes you hear people that don't really put two and two together, but a lot of times you see the light sound sensitivity, you see the brain fog, focusing, types of issues where people are like, I can't go to school, I can't be on a computer, I can't focus, I can't be around light or people. That tends to be some of your most common pieces. I would say maybe into some of your less common, or less talked about, that might be a better answer, is mood changes and emotions. Sometimes you see people who become more depressed or more anxious. Some of these pieces of not knowing where you're at in space, where now you're bumping into walls, or maybe you are, dealing like your whole right side of your body, has aches and pains, or you keep rolling your ankle. Even some digestive issues. People don't really put two and two together that a lot of these brain injuries, people end up having, digestive complaints or ulcers or reflux. And so they don't attribute that to a concussion. They just think it's, something else that just maybe came on someday. But those are some of the less common symptoms that people don't really talk about, because I think when your brain controls your whole body and you throw off your brain controls your whole body. So you can see everything from autoimmune diseases to reflux to hormonal changes, that are kind of less talked about, but they're still out there, and I would say fairly common.
Wow, that's so crazy. I've heard you talk about concussions and the link between gut health. Maybe this would be a good time to kind of go into that and the things you've learned about gut health and concussions and brain injuries.
Yeah, so the vagus nerve is definitely is becoming more and more of a buzzword, which is good to see because it's nothing new. But now people are actually talking about the vagus nerve and the brain gut relationship. Your vagus nerve is kind of the go between your brain itself and then your whole entire like visceral gut, health. And whenever you have brain dysfunction, then you're not able to like control either your autonomics, which can give you like blood flow and motility in your gut and digestion, absorption. You can really disrupt the autonomic system, but also within that vagus nerve, if that vagus nerve isn't working very well, then you can't really coordinate back and forth because everything that happens in your gut also activates the brain to do other things. So there's this really strong connection between the brain itself and the gut that kind of goes through that vagus nerve. Now, a lot of concussions will actually disrupt that whole entire brainstem. So when you look at the lower brainstem, that's where the vagus nerve is. That's where it lives. So when we have like these weird, like shear types of concussions, like in football or car accidents, or you get these whiplash injuries of the head, oftentimes kind of that middle and lower part of the brainstem become dysregulated or dysfunctional. So you start to see changes within the gut, and you can see changes like ulcers, like stomach ulcers, or the inability to heal as fast as you can, or you see a decrease in stomach acid. So now you start getting reflux or indigestion, or you can't, if you eat a steak, it just feels like a sitch in your stomach, or probably the biggest things you see is constipation. And it's really kind of fascinating when you start looking at brain gut relationships, because even some of the earliest signs of like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is actually constipation.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So it's really kind of fun when you start doing these histories on somebody who has Parkinson's, and they're like, oh yeah, I got digestive issues. You're like, yeah, when did this start? Like, it's always been that way. I've always had constipation ever since I was, in my 30s or 40s. You're like, oh, there it is. Yep. And it's even interesting when you look at kids with special needs, or you look at kind of like that, the younger, population, that actually some of the first signs that something is wrong is actually constipation.
Wow.
So in that special needs arena, a lot of kids struggle with constipation.
Wow, I did not know that. That is so interesting. It's fascinating, isn't it? Like the more we learn about the brain-gut connection, how it really is like a second brain in our bodies.
Yeah. And most people, and you've always kind of heard that too. Most people kind of refer to the gut as the second brain, and there's actually some neuronal tissue, some nervous system tissue that's actually in the gut that kind of helps to connect the two. So when you talk about similar tissues, they tend to communicate with each other. And that's what's really fascinating, I think, as research keeps coming out more and more.
Wow. Yeah. Super, super interesting. I'm curious to know also, the difference between a true concussion versus like repetitive sub concussion kind of hits, the bell ringers that you're not, fully out, but, you're it's like a repetition in a football game, for example. Do those two things kind of add up to be the same thing, or are those different?
No, they could add up. Probably your true answer is same or different. Because you can have that major concussion that, that's good. I like your questions. Okay, I'll talk about the repetitive first. So when you look at repetitive injuries, what happens with those, and this is where it can become detrimental over time, is if you get your bell rung, 20 times in a season, right? Well, every single time you get your bell rung, your body has to basically, alert the fire department. You have to go, and they're called microglia. So you have to have these microglial cells that go out and they help to kind of, put out the fire, mop it up, clean it up, make sure everything is tidy, and then kind of go back to their fire stations. But if you kind of have these like kind of bell rung, your bell rung, sometimes you can start kind of depleting some of your antioxidants in your brain. And so the one that is talked about the most is called glutathione. So you can start getting into what they call like a glutathione deficiency, that you might get that next bell rung and you didn't have enough glutathione to put out the fire. So now the fire just starts to rage. So sometimes you'll hear people that are like, oh yeah, after the 9th or 10th time, you can really see some issues. Well, it's probably because you're running out of those antioxidants and basically your fire extinguisher to put out the fire. So that's what you can see with these like subconcussed or subclinical types of concussion where, I saw stars, I got my bell rung, got my bell rung, got my bell rung. That's not a great thing either, because this is where you start sometimes seeing like the CTEs, where maybe that was starting to come across, but you never got that big time concussion that really said, hey, something is wrong with you. So as I played sports growing up too, because of that, you're like, well, I'm just going to keep going out, keep going out, keep going out. Where when you get into like a bigger concussion, it could have been maybe big enough that maybe you didn't have enough fire extinguisher at the beginning, or maybe it was just so big that the fire kind of took over control and it turned into a little bit of a wildfire, if that makes sense. Trying to give people analogies makes the brain a little bit less, weird and esoteric. But, so sometimes the bigger concussions might be like a wildfire that got out of control, where these subclinical types of things is you just over time, you kind of run out of, fire extinguishers. So they can result in the same thing. Maybe it's just looking at over time.
Gotcha. Interesting. And so is that what's happening, for example, in CTE? It's a repetition over a long period of time?
I mean, there's definitely some thoughts on that. It'd be interesting to see. I haven't had a chance to kind of read any recent research on CTE. It's a lot, because I think there's a lot of hypotheses and theories and speculations still, because, they're trying to come out with some blood work or some blood values that say, hey, do you have some early signs of it? Or there's some ways to look at it, because still, some of the biggest ways of identifying it is, with an autopsy. So I think with that, you're still speculating, but I think that's some of the theories out there is, you can look at genetics, look at the immune system, and look at like damage and say, is there some damage that's taking place over time that when we do an autopsy, we go, hey, they have some damage. So is that the same as saying, hey, I've rolled my ankle like 20 times playing, football, and, hey, you do an autopsy and you find out I got all this scarring throughout my ankle. You go, well, yeah, that makes sense. I rolled it like a bazillion times.
Wow. Yeah.
Interesting. And so I haven't had a chance to read any recent research, but, last time we were kind of looking at stuff, that's kind of where everybody sat, but I'm sure it's kind of grown.
Gotcha.
Since over the past years.
Yeah. Interesting. And you already mentioned TBI, which is, if I understand, traumatic brain injury. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. So what's the difference between a concussion and a TBI?
Yeah. So that's kind of where they talk about like concussion. Some people categorize concussion as something more mild, like, oh, it's concussed. I mean, and you have different types of concussions. I mean, I've heard of like, like you hit your head, you get a concussion. There's kind of people that talk about blast concussion. If you get into, some of the military, they'll talk about blast concussions. There's chemical concussions. So, it's concussion just basically saying, hey, my brain was injured. Where a TBI is saying like a traumatic brain injury where it was like traumatized and damaged or sheared, or did you have a stroke or, things like that. So, and that's why you get into the MTBI, which they call like mild traumatic brain injury. But I think in this office, and I feel where most people are going anymore, is that it doesn't matter if it's concussion, MTBI, or TBI. Your brain needs to be rehabbed and fixed, so that you don't end up with issues later on. So I think and feel at the moment that it seems like we're not really utilizing all those terms as much, but maybe lumping them all together, because even patients say, you sometimes see this in the auto accident world where they're like, oh yeah, my insurance said I had a minor concussion, I should be fine. Well, whatever. I mean, you're not fine. So it doesn't matter what you want to call it. So now you start seeing like post-concussive syndrome, which then kind of encompasses all of that, saying like, well, since this injury or incident, I have all of these symptoms that are related to brain function now.
Gotcha. So you can kind of call it whatever you like, but at the end of the day, the treatment is going to be, the same, obviously like individualized for the person, but it still will come down to the same treatment regardless of what you call it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so interesting. This is probably unanswerable, but do you think there are more concussions today than when you started practice? Or is it just like we talked about earlier, just so much more awareness and so many more tools, and we're talking about it a little bit more?
I think definitely awareness, because I mean, you and I grew up, it sounds like we might be around the same age, but, it's like, when we grew up, like people got their bells rung all the time, I mean, and we even did more dumb things as kids, like, jumping off of fences and cars and, all sorts of really dumb stuff. I think with sports, my daughter plays soccer, and I think definitely like, they don't allow headers now until the age of 14.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they've definitely come out with some of those rules, which is great. You've seen, kids wearing concussion helmets. You see definitely more awareness around it. So, I mean, if anything, you could maybe even speculate maybe we see less concussions, but I think it's just the awareness. And I think it's done a great job of bringing awareness. But I mean, even like this has kind of been fun, but I mean, even like your podcast, I mean, nobody was doing podcasts like this even 10 years ago, and now definitely like people like you are even bringing this to the forefront. And I think the awareness is definitely growing really fast.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. I would love to talk about the treatments that you are using and pioneering. We've already mentioned some, but can you tell us a little bit about what sets your practice apart, what you guys are doing that other people are not?
Yeah, what kind of sets us apart is we look at we use a very comprehensive approach at evaluating patients. So if so if somebody comes in with a concussion, to me it's not important just to only focus on the brain, because we can rehab the brain all day, but what if you don't have enough fuel to rehab the brain? What if you're iron anemic and you can't provide enough oxygen? What if your blood pressure is way too low and you can't provide enough oxygen and blood flow? So we like to look at the functional medicine aspect of concussions along with concussions, because you can rehab somebody all day long or give them all the exercises in the world, but if their diet is horrible and their blood sugar is low and they're anemic, you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, I've even seen this with practitioners where, even colleagues of mine that are working on concussions, and then, either I come into the mix or they refer the patient over here. And I'm like, well, the reason why they didn't get better is because they're anemic, and here's your bottle of iron and things actually should turn around pretty quick. So I think that comprehensive approach is really what sets us apart, because there has been some cases where people have all of these concussive, quote unquote, concussive symptoms, but then you come to find out that they're just really, really hypoglycemic or low blood sugar. And so their brain just doesn't have enough fuel to heal itself. So then once we kind of figure out those pieces, then we put together, is there more of like a functional medicine nutrition plan? And is there a neurological rehabilitative plan? And so on the neuro side, we can do everything from, vision therapy to vestibular therapy, hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We have a gyrostim. We use IV therapies. We can do all sorts of proprioceptive eye-hand coordination. I mean, you name it's like our therapy room is very sometimes messy looking, just because we have so many tools that we're bringing out and working with different patients, that you're like, geez, there's a lot of different things. And you can take something like a standard physical therapy exercise and you can turn that into a neurological exercise, which is really kind of fun. But that's kind of what sets us apart. I think is that creativity of neurological rehabilitation, understanding the specific aspects of where the brain was injured, working on that, and then making sure that their system from a functional medicine metabolic state is actually good, so that we can increase this rehabilitative time, or actually maybe decrease it. Because the goal at the end of the day is we have to get people back to work, back to school, back to their sports, back to life. So we try to have this very comprehensive approach so we can make that happen as fast as we can for people. And I say that's what we do, but I feel that people listening should find a practitioner that does something similar, because too often you see people that have their one tool in their one toolbox. They think they can fix the entire world with this one tool. And if it was that easy, God, life would be great.
Wow, that's interesting. I kind of picked up on that a little bit while researching this. It does seem like there's more people, they just believe in the one thing and they just kind of go with that one thing without considering what you just mentioned. There's so many different tools out there.
There are so many different tools, and nobody has the exact same concussion. And even if you did have the exact same concussion, everybody's body is different. And even if your body was the same, you have different genetics. There's too many variables to suggest that this one tool can fix everybody. And so, and I even employ that if you find somebody like that, sure, give them a try, but maybe you should run away. It's like, because like, obviously they're not understanding the entire person. And if you're not understanding the entire person, then are you really a concussion or a brain specialist? I struggle with that a little bit.
Man, this is why I love functional medicine, people. It's so refreshing to talk to people who are dealing with the root cause of the issue versus just trying to put Band-Aids on all these symptoms when they're not, again, addressing that base root cause and individualizing a program for somebody.
Exactly. It's a harder way to practice. I'm never going to make it sound easy. I mean, there's times that Dr. Maynard and I we end the day looking at each other like, I'm ready to go home, and sometimes you go home and my wife's like, you look exhausted. I'm like, I'm tired, it's because like when you individualize a plan and you're treating everybody like an individual and you don't have any protocols, you're constantly thinking and trying to figure out how to fix the root cause or even where that root cause is coming from, where, protocols would be phenomenal. God, that would be awesome. Just do a protocol and then go enjoy the evening and go, skiing in the mountains and, all those things like that. But I think that's the truest way to practice, in my opinion, is to find that root cause, individualize the plan, and then monitor them pre and post constantly, make sure that everything that you're doing is on point to get them better as fast as possible.
That's so fantastic. I love that approach. You also mentioned the use of, did you say hyperbaric oxygen chambers?
Yep.
Interesting. How do you know the mechanisms why that would be a treatment to use? I think that's super interesting.
Well, I mean, oxygen therapy is very therapeutic, / healing, we could say. So oxygen therapy is very therapeutic. So to put somebody in a chamber where they're saturated with oxygen, and then we'll use even a mask on the inside, so they're also breathing in oxygen. If you can super saturate somebody with oxygen can definitely heal tissue quicker. So when you're looking at tissue recovery, brain recovery, to utilize oxygen at a very concentrated rate can speed up that recovery. And so we tend to use it more like, sometimes we'll do like really intense therapies and then say, okay, you're going to go get hyperbaric, just almost like a recovery, because I don't want somebody to crash, after we do therapies, or we just might say, this is just part of your, we got to speed up tissue recovery as fast as we can while we're trying to do some rehab. So that's kind of how we utilize the hyperbaric instead of the traditional, like you got to come in 20 or 40 times that you hear. We actually kind of make it part of our like rehab strategy.
Interesting. And it sounds like if you had your way, you would work with a person in a short kind of time frame, but very intensely. So maybe like a week or a half a week to really knock some of these symptoms down. And then is that correct, first of all?
Yeah, it is correct. That's kind of our favorite way to practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Gotcha. Rather than like seeing somebody once a week for the rest of their life kind of approach.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think for us, it kind of gets a little bit, I would say for most practitioners, sometimes it feels a little frustrating. If you are seeing somebody once a week for the next, 12, 20,000 weeks, you're like, because you could see them for, an hour, right? But then they have the other, 6 days and 23 hours to mess themselves up. So it always feels like you're kind of fighting life a little bit and dysfunction. So usually if you get your hands on somebody more intensive, which is usually, about 4 to 6, sometimes more hours in a session, then, and I know some people go, geez, that sounds like a lot. It can be, but you can also make some really amazing changes. So if you're doing some like therapy, and you put them in the HBOT at the end of the day and let them like, kind of recover, that's definitely worth it. But what we found is you can kind of essentially take, 2, 3, 4 months and shove it into like 2 weeks, and that is kind of some of the things I think help people get back to work sooner or get back, to playing again. Because when we treat professional athletes, they don't have the luxury to say, hey, I'm going to be out for the next 6 months. You look at a football player or a hockey player, and just like, we got to get them back. So how do we get them back? Well, we got to be intensive about it. And we got to get from point A to point B as fast as I can, make sure they're safe, and then say you can go back and play. And so if we're going to do that for a football player or hockey player, why not do that for the general public? and say, hey, can we get you back on your feet so you can get back to work? And it's not like, hey, I had to go on a short-term disability for the next 3 months.
Yeah, no,
So
that's really interesting. I'd never considered that before, but that makes a lot of sense. You do talk about turning people loose back to their, normal lives. Football players probably going to get knocked around a little bit more. So, first of all, don't knock your head too much as a normal person. But what are some of the other like lifestyle things that you're the most concerned with people addressing when they are trying to work on their healing kind of long term after they've done a more intense treatment and maybe made a lot of progress?
you know that's actually where the functional medicine piece comes into play, because if we're turning somebody loose back into the world, like they're not fully 100%, right? So I mean, there's going to be some people that I'm like, you're not ready to go back, and there's some people I'm like, yeah, you actually are doing great, let's go back. And each situation is different, like putting a kid back in school, where they are in English and math and social studies. You might get to a point where you're like, okay, you're doing really well, and then you might need a break, or hey, you're doing great, but your eyes could fatigue as the day goes on. But then we can also use that as metrics. So if your eyes were fatiguing at 12 and now they're fatiguing at 2, now they're fatiguing at 6 in the evening, well, that tells me you're actually getting better, and that's really cool. But I think the functional medicine piece is saying, like, you got to eat healthy, you got to make sure things are stable, you got to do your homework. So everybody that's released still has homework to do, because it's just like, if you roll your ankle or break your leg, sure, we can work on this acutely, and you can have surgery and be put in a cast and start working with TENS units and things like that to heal. But then you also need physical therapy to kind of strengthen the leg back up, and to get all the muscles strong, so that the next time you go back on the soccer field or football field, you can actually play. And so if you kind of treat your brain similar to how you would treat your leg, it just makes sense. We can get this acutely fixed, but then we have to make it stronger, so that if you bump your head again, it doesn't take you down. And so that's kind of the long-term approach, is how do we make this system stronger and stronger and stronger? Because we also don't want things to happen when you turn 70, 80, 90, there's always kind of a short-term, long-term approach, but that's kind of how we do things in here.
Yeah, no, that's great. You mentioned nutrition, and earlier in the conversation, you mentioned blood sugar. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about nutrition and how that can play into things.
Nutrition can definitely play into things. We can use certain supplements that are anti-inflammatory, like glutathione, fish oil, turmeric, resveratrol, things like that can help with the inflammatory process. Maintaining diet and blood sugar stability is a really huge piece, because you got to have fuel. So if blood sugar is a fuel source, we got to make sure that our blood sugar is stable, to maintain energy within the cells. So that's kind of a really important piece for us, is utilizing supplements that are very specific for what we're trying to accomplish, and then maybe using things to help with the healing process, the dietary aspects of it, and things like that. So that's kind of some of the areas that we use nutrition.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was kind of led into the low carbohydrate space as a trainer and nutrition coach, because every time I would give somebody, the standard advice of, the whole grains and tons of vegetables and fruits and meal preps and constant meals during the day, my success rate was so low. And I was getting paid to give people really good results. And so I didn't really care what got them results. I just, wanted whatever would do that would be great for me. And so that kind of led me into low carbohydrate. And when we first started talking about ketogenic diets, I would talk about like a high fat diet. And it was really important to drive up ketones in the blood. And so people were drinking tons of MCT oil and eating a super high fat diet, which now I don't necessarily recommend. But do you get a little bit excited when you learn about some of the research on brain health, mental health, and kind of the low carbohydrate space we're starting to get a little more information about?
Yeah, so they've been talking about keto and brain health, and I've probably known about this for about 5, 6 years, I guess. Because I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, what? Because I mean, keto diets used to be mainly in the seizure population,
Right.
People that had seizures. And so you would see like kind of a epileptologist, and so some of those that were kind of like outside the box thinkers, where people would put people on a ketogenic diet. But it was interesting because they would actually monitor them in the hospital, so some of these like true ketogenic diets, they would kind of monitor you, and then teach you, and then let you go. And then now everybody's just doing keto. But, so some of the information that came out early on with brain injuries, which I found super fascinating, was looking at ketogenic diets and brain injury, because when your brain is injured, and so we're going to talk about more of the acute aspect of a brain injury, that whenever your brain is injured, for it to be able to process things, it may not be good. So there's even some concerns and questions at times in this, and we kind of go back and forth in the office depending on the patient, but there's even questions on like whether or not supplements would be beneficial. And the reason why is because if the brain is struggling, then can it process, supplements? Can it process anti-inflammatories? And can it process glucose? And so some of the research that was coming out was saying, well, ketones are a much easier fuel source to process than glucose is. So kind of in an acute injury, to actually kind of put somebody into a ketosis or increase their ketones, then allows the brain to utilize and kind of backdoor a neuron to say, okay, here's some fuel that's not going to drain you to try to process it, but we can actually keep your energy up. And so then that's where you kind of see like more of like your fats and low carbs and things like that. But then as soon as you get out of that, then there's also some thoughts of, maintaining like proper blood sugar, making sure you're not hypoglycemic all the time. So you kind of have to play it back and forth a little bit, but there's definitely some cool information on ketosis. And the other thing too, is when you're in ketosis or those low carb diets, is that it releases some different proteins called like sirtuin proteins, and these proteins are anti-inflammatory and can activate some of the healing responses too. So to kind of like give your brain some lower types of fuel and to activate these anti-inflammatory processes is kind of where that ketosis, concussion research came about.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. So that's kind of why I was referring to people just eating tons of fat or taking supplements, again, like MCT oil or something that's highly ketogenic. Yeah. Your liver can flip it into ketones really quick. I wouldn't normally recommend that for somebody that's just trying to lose weight. Like if you want to burn your own fat, like you need to have some fat and you need to have the ability to burn fat, but you don't need to just shove extra fat into the body. The body can't really tell whether it's fat from your food or fat from the body. And again, most people want to burn the fat on their body. But I do wonder if for mental health issues, actually going for driving up ketones as high as you can get them by taking some of those supplements, if it's warranted in that world. And I wonder directionally if it's beneficial both ways, where lowering blood glucose, something that could potentially be inflammatory in the brain, maybe that's one benefit, but the other benefit is actually getting the brain to burn ketones, which is anti-inflammatory and gives it, that fuel source. It's the research in, Alzheimer's, calling it type 3 diabetes and the brain's inability to burn glucose over time. I wonder if they're all related, and I'd love your opinion on that.
Yes, I think you actually kind of said it very well. I actually might revert to how you put that out. That was a really good summary. That's why you are seeing like, ketogenic diets with Alzheimer's and ketogenic diets with brain injuries and ketogenic diets with seizures, all these different things where the brain cannot handle, what it should be able to handle, which is unfortunate. But, so then the theory is if we can get your brain to handle it, then you shouldn't need a ketogenic diet for the rest of your life.
Right. Yeah.
Because your system is working better and it should handle glucose because that is a natural part of our evolution. So I think using these ketogenic diets are really, they're a tool.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. I love that. The term metabolic flexibility is your body's like ability to burn whatever fuel you have. And I think that's everybody's end goal in a world where we are swimming in, processed carbohydrates all over the place. It can be a tool to temporarily reteach your body to burn fat. But then as long as you're pretty reasonable about your diet, you can get off of that. And most people, I would say, don't necessarily need to be on a low carb or a no carbohydrate diet for the rest of their lives, but it can be used as a tool to kind of flip that and teach the body to use, glucose, carbohydrates, and use fat, just as long as you're not eating, 400 grams of sugar from the soda shop every single day. That's where it becomes problematic. So I love that approach to use it as a tool. I'm also curious to ask you about sleep. Where does sleep fit into this? It occurs to me that sleep is such a regenerative, practice and time for especially the brain. Have you looked much into sleep and how this can help people recover?
Well, sleep is man, hands down, probably one of the most important things that you need. And I think unfortunately, when you see brain injuries or you see stress, it can really mess up your circadian rhythm and sometimes flip it upside down where you're, awake and then sleeping during the day. So that's I would say a big struggle. Most of the time is you're trying to get somebody to sleep because their brain needs a chance to heal, but their brain is messed up, so they can't sleep. And so now you're just like chasing your tail. And this is kind of where I think supplements can come in, and even sometimes medication. I mean, we're not opposed to medication. I think there's a time and a place, but it's like that's where we try supplements first. And can we get your body to chill out and sleep, and can we get your circadian rhythm back on track? Can we get your cortisol down? Because if we can do that, then sometimes the healing process speeds up. But if you're like going to work or going to school and your brain's fried and fatigued and you're getting 2 hours of sleep, man, it feels like you're behind the eight ball, starting every single day. And that sometimes is some of the tougher battles in this clinic, is when we can't get people to sleep.
Wow. Yeah. Having a good, sleep hygiene, what a lot of people to refer to it as, making sure you're getting to bed at a consistent rate, getting the blue light out of your day as the day is unwinding and unfolding, making sure your bedroom is cool and really dark, I think is so helpful for sleep quality. And you're right. What you just described, unfortunately, I think is almost like the average. It's not normal, but if you look around, it's probably average that most people are in that state more often than not. It really sucks.
Oh, I would agree. I would say almost a majority of all the new patients that come in, it doesn't matter if they're brain injury or not, sleep is usually on that list of things that need to get improved.
I've cussed out Schitt's Creek so many times on this show for being such a good show and making me binge Netflix. And now the new season of Formula One is going to be coming on Netflix soon. That's going to ruin my sleep again. Damn you. You did mention supplements, which I think is helpful for particular reasons. And I know you mentioned a few specific ones. Can you go into a little bit greater detail of like what the purpose of some of the supplements that you recommend would be?
Well, so I feel like the purpose of supplements should be to fix something that is broken or to enhance something that is not doing well. So it's going to go back to kind of our treatment plan and individualization of supplements. But if you keep that in mind, then the goal of supplements should be, do we need to reduce brain inflammation? And if that's the case, then, do we use things like, fish oil, turmeric, glutathione? If we need to modulate the immune system because it's just gone haywire, if you watch the research and read it, there are certain things that help to modulate the immune system, like vitamin D and fish oil and glutathione. If we get into adrenal supports, like where people have cortisol issues and sleep issues, things like phosphatidylserine, is really helpful on promoting circadian rhythm. If somebody is super fatigued, using things like glycerized licorice or adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandha, holy basil leaf, and I'm rattling those off, but to kind of give an example that when you understand the mechanisms and the things that you're trying to fix, then the supplements become super powerful. And if we get away from like a symptom relief Band-Aid, then that's when you see some supplements become very powerful. So, so supplements are great, and there's something that we use in the office. I don't feel like there needs to be something that you're on for the rest of your life because you had a brain injury. I mean, every once in a while you do see some cases, and sometimes with like anxiety disorders, from a concussion, maybe GABA is a really good thing just to keep everything calm. But is there other things that we need to look at? If somebody has to stay on a supplement for the rest of their life, did we miss something, in this whole like rehabilitative process, and maybe not, and that's why you see some people just might need, adaptogenic herbs because their life is super stressful. Maybe they got a loved one or a parent with Alzheimer's or, something like that, where sometimes life is just hard. And so I think there's a time when, maybe you need to be on supplements, but it should be just a couple here and there, but not the traditional, unfortunately, what you see in functional medicine where people literally have cabinets or pantries full of supplements that they don't even use anymore.
Yeah. Wow. No, I absolutely love that approach. I love that you are targeting specific reasons, specific time frames for specific people because, early in my career, everybody needed a multivitamin and everybody needed vitamin D and melatonin and all this crap that they probably didn't need and probably caused more harm than good anyway.
Yeah,
Mm.
no, absolutely. So I wish that would change a little bit, you know, but yeah, I don't, who knows?
Yeah, totally. Totally. So in physical rehabilitation, a new term has kind of come up in the last decade or two, which is like prehab. There's things that you can do before getting injured or before going into a surgery that will help you recover faster and rehabilitate way better. Is it along the same lines of things that you would recommend for people, maybe they haven't gotten a concussion so far in life, it could always happen. Are there certain lifestyle practices that you really like to see people do to be able to deal with it in the future in case they have a concussion?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is you got to keep that inflammation down, because kind of going back to the fire extinguisher analogy is that if you have a really good fire department and all your fire extinguisher canisters are filled up, then when you hit your head or you get in a car accident or something happens, you should be able to put out that fire. But if you're eating unhealthy, your hormones are off, your thyroid is off, you're anemic, you're eating poorly and drinking and all these things like that, you constantly have to put out the inflammation daily. And if you're constantly inflamed and then you hit your head, your recovery may not be so good.
Mm.
And so I think when we talk about prehab, I hadn't heard of that before, but if we're looking at that as a concept, it's almost like an insurance policy. If you're taking care of yourself before the concussion, then you pray and you're hoping that all the hard work that you did, then comes back to serve you well in the recovery process.
Mm.
And I think that's what we all hope for. And it doesn't matter if it's a concussion or if you get sick or if you catch a bug, like you really hope that your state of health at the exact moment helps you to overcome whatever, however life like slaps you in the face at times.
Yeah. No, that's right. You mentioned the bug. I don't know if you realize we had a pandemic. I don't know if anybody told you. And in the beginning of the pandemic, I tried to be really respectful about this, but I just made a post that just said, look, we were telling you to be strong. We were telling you to get sunlight and to lift heavy things sometimes and to eat well and to do things to create an inner strength and resilience because, we know what happened now. A lot of people who were sick and chronically ill heading into the pandemic didn't do that great with the disease. And all of these things are practices that we can implement at a very low cost and low barrier to entry, and that will make us stronger and help us be ready for those more dramatic and traumatic events in our life. So I love that approach. I think that's a really thoughtful answer. I appreciate some of those lifestyle factors. What are some of the ones that you implement that you really enjoy in your own personal life?
Honestly, in transparency, probably the best thing that I've been working on lately is self-care. I think that's something that you're starting to hear that more and more, which is really nice. And I think we all can be guilty of that at time of not taking care of yourself. And I think especially when you get into like doctors and practitioners, sometimes you spend all your time taking care of everybody else and then you kind of get left in the back. So I think if people engage in self-care, and then eat healthy and exercise, man, that can go such a long ways that I would say from my own experience, I didn't realize how far that can go. Like I knew about it, I hear about it, I preach it, but then to like actually do it, it doesn't have to be crazy, but I think self-care is say, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to keep my information down. I'm going to, hang out with friends and laugh and love and live. It's kind of what you hear from all the younger generations: live, laugh, love constantly. But I think engaging in self-care and going for walks, and all those pieces, I think those are the things that really prep your body, I think, to handle life and to handle stress and to handle illnesses and disease the best you can. And so that's what I would give you from what I've learned personally. That's, you preach it and you finally do it and you go, God, I am smart. I just need to take my own time.
That's a great point. It feels selfish initially, taking time for yourself and doing some of those things, but that is what is going to help you continue to care for so many people and share your message and your treatments with so many more people. So I'm really glad that you have approached life differently that way, and I hope you continue to do so. When you look back on your career so far, what makes you the most proud?
I think what makes me is probably different because we're talking about health, but I think in my career, I think maintaining a business that is allowed to serve the public is probably the thing that I'm most proud because I think you can be a very smart doctor, but you also have to run a business that I think also treats people well, and does people well. And so I think that's probably my proudest moment because I've seen a lot of friends and colleagues that I would say are super crazy smart. And I would trust them with my family and their business isn't doing well. So I think that's a piece I'm probably most proud of because at the end of the day, we're here to serve, but if we don't have a great vessel to serve, then, are we able to do what we need to? So that's probably my proudest thing.
Yeah. What a great answer. I absolutely love that. This has been a fascinating conversation and really fascinating topic to deep dive into. What is one simple tip that you would like to leave for the listener that they can take away from this conversation and apply in their lives?
I would say, it's funny. I'm going to give you an answer that we haven't even talked about. So
Perfect.
I'll give you,
love it.
I'll give a short answer. I think one of the things that people can do would be run a very comprehensive blood work and have somebody that understands how to read blood work or functional medicine go over it with you because how do you know if you're inflamed, then looking at blood work. If you're anemic, you'll pick it up on blood work. If your thyroid's off, you'll pick it up on blood work. If you're diabetic, you'll pick it up on blood work. I think that's probably one of the best things that you can do from a pre-rehab standpoint is maybe run some labs and see what you look like and start fixing those things, and whether that's, drinking less, eating some more veggies, self-care, exercising, walking, do all the things to increase your insurance so that if you get sick or something happens that, you're in a better position to overcome it.
Mm. That's a fantastic answer and so critical to do what you said and find the right person because it's such a different experience to get a lab run and have somebody tell you yeah, this is high, this is low, not looking at the whole picture and the context of everything. I think it's so important to find the right person in functional medicine who can read that for you. So I think that's great advice. Dr. Shane Steadman, where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work?
We are at integratedbraincenters.com. We also have integrated health systems or healthdenver.com. So there's two places. And obviously we're always on social media with our Instagram and Facebook posts where, we post a lot of things on there, like all our different webinars, that we do. We do a ton of, we did one last night on dysautonomia, so we do webinars and we try to educate, the community and the public as much as, you're trying to as well. So follow us on our social media and, Integrated Health Denver, integratedbraincenters.com. And, we're all here hanging out.
Fantastic. Dr. Shane Steadman, thank you so very much for all of your work, for being willing to learn new techniques and not just pigeonhole yourself into one thing. We really appreciate how important your work is and what a difference you're making for people who are in quite a bit of pain and really suffering. So thank you so very much for everything that you do, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on our show today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.